Amos constructed a life that was as much like being married to Hilly as he could contrive to make it without going so far as to destroy the harmony of Regent's Park Road. Amos continued to make his opinions heard on matters of the day, directly in articles as well as more obliquely in his fiction. His targets were many: sloppy language, education. Steve, in Stanley and the Women, belonged to one of the generations which had never been taught anything about anything. The Arts Council. Subsidy damages art by tending to foster irresponsibility, showiness, cliquism, and self-indulgence in the artist, he wrote to the Times in 1985. Restaurants. Explicit sexual description, or ESD. The condition of the Church of England, which he thought by 1987 might achieve what even communism had failed to do, and rob England of religion once and for all. Sod the public tendencies, meaning roughly that the consumer is always wrong, to be found in everything from architecture to typography, and of course leftyism in all its many forms. Britain turned formally to the right with the election of Mrs. Thatcher in 1979, but the dominant intellectual literary tone was still left-wing, shading into political correctness when the collapse of communism and the Berlin Wall made traditional socialism unfashionable, except to a handful of diehards. By these prevailing standards, Amos was undoubtedly a reactionary. Such a simple and dismissive label, though, contains only enough likeness to him for a caricature, but too little to make a portrait. Amos discovered many of his opinions by testing fashion or trend against reality as he understood it. Feminism, for instance, was fashionable, and one of its beliefs was that women's talents had been consistently undervalued. But was this true? One obvious test for Amos to make was in English poetry. A Don called Smith in Jake's Thing ticks off the record of women's achievements in this art, as he and Amos sees it. There is Catherine Phillips, otherwise the matchless Orinda, who lived from 1631 to 64. After her, Anne Finch, Countess of Winchelsea, 1661 to 1720, which left only one more, Christina Rossetti, 1830 to 94. Not much to show for 600 years of English literature, and no other contenders in sight. Certainly not Sylvia Plath, the most widely admired woman poet of recent times. It shook Amos when Philip Larkin chose her collected poems as his Book of the Year in 1981. Surely she was no good, really, as he put it to Conquest. Yet there was no obvious reason why women should not write poetry. Being a poet is not a full-time occupation, ideally suited, in fact, to the odd hours and half-hours of spare time that crop up regularly in the course of women's lives. These were just what a poet needed to get out a poem in draft and put in a bit of work on it, as Amos himself did. Women had performed much better as novelists, though why was mysterious. The point was that they had failed in poetry, which must indicate some defect or deficiency. This failure was just as mysterious as women's success in novels, but there it undeniably was. A judgment like this was typical of Amos. It did not involve sweeping generalizations, but covered only poetry, which Amos knew about. His list of good women poets was exceedingly short, but then his list of good male ones was not very long either. He was no more likely to include Ted Hughes, Sylvia Plath's former husband, in his tally of good male poets, than he was Plath in his tally of good female ones, just because both were fashionable. "Saw another shortest book t'other day," Amos once wrote to Conquest. "The achievement of Ted Hughes." Nor did Philip Larkin's endorsement of Plath have the slightest effect on Amos's opinion of her. Amos might be deeply fond of Larkin and admire him as a poet, second only to A.E. Housman, but that did not mean Amos accepted his judgments. "Old Philip was given to literary passions that I have never shared at all," Amos wrote to Anthony Powell after Larkin died. "As for the poetry of Hardy, William Barnes, and Stevie Smith, the novels of B. Pym, etc." Lastly, Amos did not offer any explanation or theory about why women had performed so poorly as poets, because he did not have any. He merely observed what he considered to be the facts, and argued his case as far as he rigorously could take it. A serious Amos judgment had to be defensible in argument, and it had to be one that he had arrived at strictly for himself. If the opinion he reached at this way turned out to be reactionary, so be it. It was their readiness to follow fashionable opinions that Amos found contemptible in far too many supposed opinion-formers, especially literary folk. They didn't make up their own minds, but followed the pack. Talking about the writer Blake Morrison, Amos said in a letter to Conquest, "The trouble with chaps like this is they have no taste. I don't mean bad taste, Just the mental organ that makes you say this is bloody good and this is piss is simply missing, and they have to orientate themselves by things like importance and seriousness and depth and originality and consensus equals trend. It was this lack of taste that let writers like William Golding, John Fowles, and John le Carré, and many others too, including Anthony Burgess, Thomas Pynchon, Patrick White, and Samuel Beckett, earn reputations they didn't deserve. Once a reputation began to take shape, literary folk were afraid to question it for fear of being out of step with fashion. They didn't trust their own judgment. Amis trusted his. You might disagree with his opinions, but you were not in doubt as to whose opinions they were. Something more than taste or preference went into Amis's opinions. There were moral factors, too. If women talked too much, they were wasting your time, and so robbing you of the most valuable of possessions. Sod the public architects and many other suppliers of goods and services were simply cheating clients and customers. Overpriced, over-fancy restaurants, for example. Coteries of self-appointed experts who foisted unreadable poetry or non-musical music or meaningless paintings on the public were the same or worse. Sloppy language was laziness. Critics and pundits who took their opinions from others were lazy too. They were simply not working hard enough at their jobs if they could not make up their own minds, but had to take in their views at second hand. The ethics of his father, especially the virtue of hard work, were never far from Amis's mind, consciously or not. Many of his sharpest opinions Amis kept for his letters to Robert Conquest. By the 1980s, Conquest was firmly established in America, but he liked to be kept in touch with what was going on back in Britain, and was an enthusiastic letter writer. Amis was less so, often responding to 2 or 3 of Conquest's letters with only a single one of his own. When he did get around to writing, he set out to be entertaining as well as informative. A certain amount of creative embroidery went into embellishing the gossip and the opinions, but the authentic Amis sounds through too, often the more authentic sounding for being heard in a private letter rather than a book or an article. Amis could be amusing and abrasive, even about his son Martin. In February 1981, he reported to Conquest that Harold Evans had been switched from the editorship of the Sunday Times to that of the Times, and repeated the crack he had been making in the Garrick Club. Things have come to a pretty pass when the editor of the Times' girlfriend is one of my son's cast-offs. Amis meant Tina Brown, who later became Evans's wife, as well as editor of Vanity Fair and the New Yorker. 5 years later, he reported with dismay that Martin had gone all lefty and of the crappiest, neutralist kind, challenging me to guess how many times over the world can destroy itself. In fact, going on like H. Pinter does these days, I hear. Amis asked Conquest to recommend a book that might change Martin's mind. He's bright, you see, but a fucking fool, and the worse, far worse, for having come to it late in life. ATAT, aged nearly 37, not 17. Amis was no kinder about Martin's novels. Between ourselves, I only read about half, Amis said of one published in 1981. Too boring. Little sod said on TV you had to read it twice. Well then, he's failed, hasn't he? But Martin knew more or less what his father thought of his work, could indeed make a reasonable guess at what page of any given novel of his Amis Pear would send the book spinning across the room in exasperation. Martin continued to read his father's work, while knowing his father did not read his own, or not all the way through. The difference between their novels was something of a puzzle to Amis Sr., since their methods seemed to have so much in common. Both agreed on the importance of traditional elements like plot and character, and yet the results were so unalike. Martin was inclined to think that the novel had simply moved on into postmodern forms, leaving his father behind, stuck in old-fashioned realism. Any suggestions of that kind were apt to rouse snorts of derision from his father. The two of them tended to keep off such delicate matters, so as not to spoil their regular weekly dinners together, or the weekends when Martin brought round his children to Regent's Park Road. Other writers came in for similarly uninhibited treatment in Amis's letters. Tom Stoppard, the playwright, was amiable enough, pity his work is no good. Bernard Levin, the journalist, has become a pompous buffoon. Tom Paulin, the poet, was a little twit. Another poet, Craig Raine, was that fool. George Hartley, Philip Larkin's Hull publisher, was that little turd. But Amis was even more uninhibited in his opinions about events or trends. In his letters he thought the unthinkable, or at any rate, the not easily printable. One persistent theme was what he called the fallacy of impartiality, the assumption that in every story there are two sides meriting equal attention and respect. for example, the IRA and the British Army in Ulster, or urban rioters and the police, or the two giant powers, America and the Soviet Union. That little bastard Jonathan Dimbleby is doing a series on that, Amis wrote in September 1981, called The Eagle and the Bear, instantly implying the two are, so to speak, equidistant from us, and we can and should weigh them in the same balance. The following year, during the Falklands War, Amis berated the BBC for being similarly objective between the two sides. In November, it was the Observer's turn to be berated for implying that the Israelis had carried out the massacres of Palestinians in Beirut, and quoting two sources to back their case, Yasser Arafat and the PLO's man in New York. The next year, Amis invented a name for this kind of thinking: seditious neutrality. In 1985, he found another example of it in the row over the SAS shooting of 3 IRA terrorists in Gibraltar. When is it all right to shoot at a terrorist? Answer, when he's blown your head off. What Amis didn't like about this kind of attitude was its flabbiness, similar in its way to the flabby thinking of literary folk who didn't make up their own minds but followed the trend. How I hate all that talk of moderation and reasonableness and flexibility, especially the last, meaning the readiness to give in. Most of the time, Amis knew exactly where he stood, though he missed having someone like Conquest, more expert than himself, to discuss politics with. At the Garrick Club, he only saw shoot-the-lot reactionaries. It was nice to know they're there, he wrote, but unsatisfying after a bit. Amis even tested out ideas about race on Conquest. Though Jews were among his friends from school days, and he had hated Nashville for its racist climate, he nevertheless wondered on paper if there might not be something in prejudices against both blacks and Jews. In 1984, some anon shag from New York sent him a book by Wilmot Robinson called The Dispossessed, which claimed that an alliance of liberals and ethnic minorities were pushing white Anglo-Saxons out of power and influence in America. This set him off speculating. Hard on the Jews, natch, but then you pick up the Sunday paper, and in the ST, Sunday Times, review alone, you find Susan Sontag, G. Steiner, a Russian Jewish novelist, Freud, Stephen Marcus, a new U.S. Jewish pop novelist, and no doubt others. Yes, Mel Brooks, all writing or being written about, and you start shamefacedly and reservedly thinking he may have something. 4 years later, he speculated that the great Jewish vice is glibness, fluency, also possibly just bullshit, as in Marx, Freud, Marcuse. Pity L. Ron Hubbard not. Amis thought that other races had their shortcomings too, which he was equally willing to face. The British Philistine, for example, was crude, ignorant, aggressively uncultured, while the American variety was lettered, art-loving, philosophy-grabbing. The Americans were tremendously anti-British, or rather anti-English. They liked the Scots, as for example Scotty in the television series Star Trek, and the Campbells, who get into that terrible tenement symphony in the big store, alongside the Cones and the fucking Kellys, the Shagbags and the Vermicellis, or whatever, but not the Digby Featherstone Howes. Amis's speculations about race tended to break down like that into laughter and jokes. There might be something in race prejudices worth thinking about, but they didn't stand up to Amis's scrutiny in the way that women, being no good at poetry, did, so he did not go further than speculate. For him, race, like class, was more about colourfulness than colour, something to raise a laugh from more than to work up a lather about. Amis was well aware of the vagaries of reputation, not least his own, and the chance ways in which they might be formed against the grain of the truth. Soon after John Betjeman died, in 1984, he wrote to Conquest, "Wherever I go nowadays I hear tales of what a shit Betjeman was to his secretaries, swearing at them, making them cry, having to have a new one every few weeks. Amis had never made a secretary cry, but Betjeman would go down to history as a genial teddy-bear figure beloved of all, while a nice old softy like me will be taken as a curmudgeonly old shit." Who could tell how one might wind up looking in the history books? I expect if the truth were known, Pope was an absolute charmer, encouraging young poets and visiting the sick, and Lamb behaved like Dylan Thomas. The exact opposite of their historical reputation in both cases. On the whole, though, Amis was indifferent to what people thought of him. He usually spoke up on any issue he was asked about, so long as he had something to say, and if the fallout seemed damaging, he didn't much care. The received opinion with which his own clashed was usually no more than fashionable and probably wrong. Time would vindicate him. Besides, the older you got, the more immune to criticism you became. Anticipating the imminent publication of his novel Difficulties with Girls in 1988, Amis told Conquest he thought the omens were good and added cheerfully, "You know, when you're old enough you can get away with piss. C.F. Graham Greene," of whose work, from at least as early as The Human Factor of 1978, Amis thought very little indeed, though it continued to be respectfully received by the critics. There were some things he might think sound enough, but perhaps tactless to put in front of the public. Better to confine them to conversation or a letter to Conquest. You could give one hostage to fortune too many. One that he withheld was a poem, of which he sent an unfinished draft to Conquest in 1987. "Women and queers and children cry when things go wrong. Not fair, why me, can't take it. So drones, sounds, their dismal, eternal song. The usual sort of men, who hold the world together, manage to face their front in any sort of weather. With rueful grins and curses they push the world along, but women and queers and children cry when things go wrong." He polished his lines a bit. The last two lines of the first verse became, "Why me, not him, you're horrid, always the same old song." But he never got around to publishing them, and he has not written another poem since. 21. The last chapter. The Queen's and the Garrick. "My life is just work, family, club, plus Swansea now, and very nice too," Amis wrote to Conquest in September 1987. He had by then settled firmly into a routine from which he cared less and less to stir. Work, lunch, snooze, more work, television, drinks, supper, a spot of reading, bed. On Saturdays the Queen's pub stood in for the Garrick at lunchtime, on Sundays Odette's restaurant. One night a week there was dinner with Martin, and at weekends supper with his neighbours the Huffs, at his place or theirs. Age made an increasingly convenient excuse for refusing all other evening invitations, especially dinner parties, which Amis had never liked anyway, though he was still available for lunches with the right person at the right place. In the basement of the house in Regent's Park Road there was his first ex-wife Hilly, and not far away, in flats of their own, were his son Philip and his daughter Sally. The essential tools, drink, television, books, typewriter, were sufficient and to hand. It was all as comforting and anxiety-suppressing as could be arranged. Not perfect, but adequate. In its mood, as well as much of its detail, very like the circumstances of Harry Caldecott, hero of Amis's 1990 novel, The Folks That Live on the Hill. If Harry looked out of his window in Shepherd's Hill, he saw a wine emporium called Potandum, while if Amis looked out of his in Primrose Hill, he saw one called Bidendum. If Harry wanted a drink, he went to the King's public house, as Amis went to the Queen's. To eat locally, Harry would go to O'Deal's, as Amis went to Odette's. Harry's club was the Irving, just around the corner from Amis's Garrick. For newspapers and stamps, both Harry and Amis could resort to a sub-post office along the road, run by amiable Asians. Retired from his librarian's job, Harry, though far from rich, has the time and money to do pretty much as he pleases. He has been married twice, but considers that he has had enough of that state to last him indefinitely. Marriage, he thinks, has certain positive advantages, but he tells his friends at the Irving, many or even most of them seemed to be at least adequately supplied by having one's widowed sister housekeep for one. Harry spends most of his time taking a benevolent interest in the affairs of a flock of mostly local people with problems that range from drink to money to lesbian bust-ups. They include friends, close relatives, and distant ones too. His brother Freddie, his sister Claire, his ex-stepdaughter Bunty, his first ex-wife's sister's child, Fiona Carr Stuart. He liked being where he was, Harry finds himself thinking, which these days boiled down to his house, the surrounding quasi-village, the King's, the Irving, the occasional pal. On the other hand, he felt nothing for his house except as the place where he lived, and the people around him are not much of a set of human reasons for wanting to stay in Shepherd's Hill. So why does he stay? Especially when he gets an excellent offer for his line of work from America. His sister Claire comes up with an answer when she tells him why she doesn't want him to go. "My life is here with you, and you're awful. But you're family, and I'm used to you. And you know I don't think anybody in the world understands as well as I do how important it is to be used to someone." There is a version in this of Amis's life in Primrose Hill, above all perhaps in the importance of having around him someone he is used to. The one break in his London routine Amos now chose to make was the 3 weeks he spent in Swansea with his old friends Eve and Stuart Thomas, timed to coincide with the 3 weeks in August and September when the Garrick shuts for its summer holiday. Here a loose simulacrum of the London routine was followed. A bit of work in the morning, a bit more in the evening, television, drinks, and so forth, with the Bristol Channel Yacht Club on the Mumbles shore standing in for the Garrick. Or at least it stood in until 1993, when Stuart Thomas was expelled after 40 years' membership, following a row with the committee, whereupon Amos instituted his own boycott, declining to cross the threshold again after being a member for nearly as long as Thomas. Local pubs made perfectly satisfactory substitutes, and the Bee's Knees restaurant provided an acceptable lunch at however unconventionally late an hour Amos and party reached it from the pub. Swansea was a break, but not exactly a cure. You probably wondered if I was dead, Amos wrote to Conquest from there in early September 1987. Well, I bloody nearly am, or at least my demise has been brought appreciably closer by a couple of weeks in Wales, with another yet to come. Not only the raised alcohol intake, but the eating of lethal food. Swansea contains the South Wales chapter of the Friends of Cholesterol. My Aussie China Jim Durham is here briefly, helping to provide a peak of self-inflicted damage. Boozing at Swansea was indeed prodigious. It was while Amos was putting his shoes on to go down to the yacht club that he got the idea for his 1986 novel The Old Devils, about a bunch of oldsters retired from most serious activities apart from that of drinking their heads off. Age took its physical toll too. Had last 6 upper teeth whipped out and denture triumphantly installed. Very comf so far, Amos told Conquest in July 1986. By then, Amos had also become seriously fat, a process which began when he gave up smoking, and drinking for 6 months too, to compensate for which he went in for comfort eating. Martin remembers his father stuffing himself with chocolates until his face swelled like a football. Amos stopped eating so much when he started drinking again, but the newly acquired weight did not disappear, indeed continued to accumulate. Amos's clothes now had to be bought at an outsized shop, and he needed size 17.5 collars on his shirts. Soon after he gave up smoking, he gave up snuff, too. This was certainly good for his general demeanour. He had taken to snorting up great pyramids of powder from the back of his hand, triggering gigantic sneezes that had to be staunched with sheets torn from a toilet roll he carried everywhere for the purpose. Amos's legs began to let him down, suffering from circulation problems which made trips on foot of more than a few yards difficult. The climb up the staircase to the Garrick Club's first-floor bar had by the early 1990s to be taken in stages, and the short distance along Regent's Park Road to the Queen's public house had to be made by taxi. Deafness left its mark too. The television volume control now had to be turned up to higher levels for the bill, and in a crowded bar or restaurant, Amos would lean towards the person he was listening to, sometimes cocking a helpful hand to his ear, so adding a brush-stroke or two to his pinkly, blimpish image. In general, though, Amos remained in obstinately robust good health. He might abuse his body with alcohol and lack of exercise, and worry in hypochondriacal style about every sign of illness, real or imagined, but illness remained mostly in his imagination. In the letter to Conquest in which he announced the loss of his teeth, he also reported that a new doctor had given him a liver test, which revealed only the faintest murmur of protest. And so his liver remained triumphantly resilient against the odds, like his other vital organs. Amos's doctors muttered darkly about his drinking, but what was the point of bullying him about it? Drink was so much part of him by now that telling him to give up or cut down would cause more problems than it would solve. The passing of years brought with it the inevitable passing of friends. At times death seemed so frequent as to be almost part of Amos's routine. When the television producer and presenter Hugh Weldon died in 1986, Amos told Conquest wearily, "The Westminster Abbey again. My minicab drivers are beginning to know where to drop me for the west door." Tibor Samuli had been the first of Amos's greatest friends to die, going suddenly of cancer at the age of 47 in 1973. Samuli was the friend with whom he had grown intimate most quickly, and the one he had known least long, having only been introduced to him by Conquest in the mid-1960s, soon after he arrived in Britain, a Hungarian refugee from communism. In his memoirs, Amos had valued him most of all for his steady, underlying cheerfulness and optimism. The two of them got into the habit of talking on the telephone most days, for no special reason, just like a couple of bloody women, as Samuli put it. Philip Larkin, Amos's longest-standing close friend, went next. Amos recorded something of his feelings about Larkin's decline and demise in his letters to Conquest. "Old Philip is back at Newland Park, Larkin's home in Hull," he wrote in July 1985, "rather sooner than I thought they gave us to understand, after an operation to remove his esophagus. He sounded very back to form on the blower the night before last, as regards tone, that is. Content pretty gloomy, though no words were dropped. Doesn't expect to work, at Hull University Library, again. Not much one can say, but I intend to keep up a barrage of letters." Larkin being particularly fond of getting letters, this would be a special comfort to him. In October, Amos wrote, "Have had, perhaps you too, a very gloomy letter indeed from old Philip, talking of his hours of fear, 4 to 8 a.m. Continuous thoughts of death, dread of possible more surgery, total lack of appetite. But it seems clear from one phrase about Monica, Jones, Larkin's longtime girlfriend who was also ill, no one knows what's the matter with her either, my underlining, that he doesn't know, in the sense in which you know the date, what they found." Larkin had not been told of the cancerous tumour which had been discovered in his throat, too far advanced for surgery. I try to write often, avoiding such themes. Amos thought Larkin was hard up for something to do, and wanted to suggest to him that he put his unpublished early poems together. The trouble with that was that it would imply he wouldn't be around to do the job later. Besides, Larkin wouldn't do it anyway, the silly old perfectionist. Amos had suggested visiting Larkin in Hull, but you know how cagey he is. Larkin replied to Amos asking him to leave it for a bit. He was in no state for a visit of more than an hour or two, and any such visit would be bound to centre on lunch, and I can't fucking eat fuck all. On the 21st of November, Larkin dictated his last letter to Amos. He had been in and out of hospital for tests, and that day was therefore the big one. The doctors were looking for something, and I bloody well hope they don't find it. Larkin's spirits were about as low as I can remember. He thanked Amos's daughter Sally for a letter and photograph, hoping he would be able to write and thank her personally one day. Larkin noticed strong resemblances between Sally and Hilly, and added that Hilly was the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, without being in the least pretty. I'm sure you know what I mean, and I hope she will too. 10 days later he was dead. On the 9th of December, Amos went to Larkin's funeral, and in a New Year's Day letter described it to Conquest. It wasn't a bad day, as such things go. Up in the train with Chas Monteith, a director of Faber's, Larkin's publisher, Andrew Motion, who seems not a bad chap, though again how unwanted a word from P. Motion had been a colleague of Larkin's at Hull, and wife Blake Morrison, who as the Observer's literary editor had published reviews by Larkin, and Hilly, who was fond of Larkin, Nat. Usual BR journey, 40 minutes late at Doncaster, etc. My first visit to Hull, though we never actually got there, because very decent solicitor met us at a suburban station, gave us lunch at his house, which commanded wonderful mysterious view of the tops of the Humber Bridge above the mist. Drove us to the church in another suburb. Big place, crammed with university people, perhaps 500 strong. Good full service, O God our help, lead kindly light, the day thou gavest. I orated, very few at graveside. Sister and niece, couple from Leicester, some from Hull. Not Monica, who couldn't make it on medical advice. No invitation to go to house, so we buggered off rather miserably, in our case without ever having seen it. Back on the train with junk food and scotch. Amos never did get to see Larkin's home in Hull, before or after the poet's death. In fact, he did not see Larkin in Hull for the whole 30 years that Larkin was the university librarian there. Larkin had visited Amos in Swansea, Cambridge and London, and Amos made return visits to him when he worked in libraries at Leicester and Belfast, but Larkin did not seem to want him in Hull. The reasons for this were and remain mysterious. Amos's best guess was that Larkin would have been embarrassed to let his old friend catch a glimpse of the humdrum life he lived, among humdrum people, especially the woman he was involved with. Monica Jones had been his steady, though not exclusive, girlfriend since Amos had used parts of her character for parts of Margaret Peel's in Lucky Jim. Amos thought she was a pest and a bore, and that Larkin probably thought the same, and had very likely said so in the diaries that were burned after his death. Amos at first thought Monica had burned them for that reason, but later discovered it was Larkin's solicitor, Terence Weldon, who was responsible. But there were other women in Larkin's life, like Maeve Brennan, whom Amos had known nothing about. "I never heard a word about her," Amos wrote to Conquest the following November, "except that solitary 'Maeve wants to marry me' blurting. You too, I think. He didn't half keep his life in compartments. But then he may simply have thought she wasn't important enough to go on about. Well, we shall never know." A year after Larkin's death, Amos reported to Conquest on an anniversary radio program, The Bicycle-Clipped Misanthropist, which consisted of reminiscent chat by various Hull people. Honestly, the worst kind of North Country cheap-jack homely wisdom you can imagine. Everybody talked on the level of, he perhaps had a forbidding exterior, but really he was very warm, with a word for everyone. The only point of interest was that P had a telescope on his window-sill to get a better view of passing tits. Amos also went on an exhibition of Larkin's stuff at University College London. He would have copied out Larkin's poem, Letter to a Friend About Girls, from the manuscript on display, but that would have taken him all day, and it would have been too depressing for words. Over the years, Amos found Larkin close in several senses. Larkin stood his round, but stopped well short of generosity. The same caution infected the rest of his life too, from his women to his writing. He never married, and after 2 novels never published another. Amos thought he did not dare to take the risk of committing himself to a woman for life, or to a novel for the year it might take to write. After all, neither marriage nor novel might work out. He did not, as Amos puts it, throw himself at life. But they got on extremely well. Theirs was the sort of friendship that could be picked up at once. A gap of days or months made no difference. Conversation would start up again as if they had met only yesterday. Larkin was funny and warm and sociable, and he and Amos spoke to each other on the same wavelength, about writing or politics, or just things that were going on in the world. They did not always agree, especially on literary matters, but they knew each other well enough to avoid dangerous territory. Larkin might have wanted to talk literary theory, but he knew Amos would not, so he kept off it. Since Larkin read and advised Amos on the first draft of Lucky Jim, he had not had much influence on Amos as a writer, except in the most general sense, as a standard or example, Larkin being the living poet Amos most admired. There was something else about him, though, something more that Amos could not quite pin down. He agreed with Conquest that Larkin was something over and above friend and poet, but what? I don't know. Presence? Amos was writing a few weeks after Larkin's death. I keep forgetting he's dead for a millisecond at a time. I must tell, ask, etc. Philip. Oh Christ, I can't. I didn't realize how often I must have thought of him. Amos continued to think of him, and in his memoirs wrote, My sorrow at his death, and my abiding sense of loss is tinged with regret. He was my best friend, and I never saw enough of him, or knew him as well as I wanted. Other friends went too, John Betjeman and John Brain, for example, but Amos's greatest personal loss after Larkin was George Gale, the journalist. Because Gale worked in Fleet Street, latterly for the Daily Mail, he was more easily available at the end of the telephone for drinks, meals, conversation. When he died in 1990, Amos was cut off in one way or another from all his greatest friends. Zamuli, Larkin, and Gale were dead. Conquest and Paul Fussell were in America. His Australian China, Jim Durham, the psychologist, was back home, down under. Stuart Thomas was in Swansea. There was thus a hole in Amos's daily life. Their absence left him a little lonelier than he would have liked to be. But there were other compensations. Honours came Amos's way. The CBE in 1981, an honorary fellowship from Swansea in 1985, the Booker Prize for the Old Devils in 1986, a knighthood in 1990. Amos enjoyed all these thoroughly, suffering no false modesty or lefty qualms about the honours system. Since he was profoundly fond of his country and its traditions, he was genuinely glad to be recognised through its official system of honours. One omission rankled a bit, though. No university seemed to think him worth an honorary doctorate. Philip Larkin had scored 7, but Amos got none. He wasn't jealous of his old friend, who he thought thoroughly deserved all the recognition he got. But why not him too? The scale of his output compared with Larkin's was vast. More than 20 novels, lifetime collections of poetry and short stories, anthologies from science fiction to songs, a couple of collections of criticism, not to mention sundry reviews, polemics, and a volume of memoirs. Surely this should count for something at the universities. Probably it was this fecundity that was his undoing. A smallish, well-managed oeuvre like Larkin's was better calculated to catch the academic eye than Amos's sprawling achievement. Besides, wasn't Amos best known as a comic writer? a chastiser of university standards, a right-winger of Thatcherite tendency. To add to his sense of well-being, Amos became quite seriously well off. In 1986 he told Conquest that his accountant had said he could afford to retire when he was 75, yet well before he reached that age he did not argue if called a rich man. All his novels, back to Lucky Jim, were available in paperback, and bits and pieces of money kept turning up from all over the place. A few quid from South Korea, for instance, when the television version of The Green Man was shown there. It all added up to a tidy annual income, enough for him to give up work if he wanted to. But he did not want to. In his later years, Amos gave up many things. Women, parties, travel. He gave up campaigning, too. Not that he had been more than a reluctant activist since about 1941. In 1984 he turned out as a member of the Writers' Guild to thwart the efforts of the leftish Theatre Writers' Union to have its members made members of the Guild as well. By God, they were cross when I and 40 other specially alerted righties turned up and voted them down, Amos told Conquest. Great example of democracy in action. Thereafter his zeal, such as it was, fizzled out. Latterly, only one campaign attracted his attention. It was called Pipe Down, and its purpose was to stop music from being played in pubs by leaving cards in the bar warning the publican that one at least of his customers would not be returning if the music continued. Amos stopped reading anything new, too. Thrillers were admissible because they had plots, characters, action, all the ingredients which seemed to him to have gone missing from so-called serious literature. For reasons like these, he told Martin that he would never pick up a novel again that did not begin along the lines, "A shot rang out." He reread old favourites, Anthony Powell, Christopher Isherwood, Evelyn Waugh, C.S. Forester. Fiction like theirs could be guaranteed to deliver, so why waste time on new stuff that would almost certainly disappoint? If Amos lost enthusiasm for reading new novels, however, he did not lose his enthusiasm for writing them. Far from it. After the relatively barren years of the early 1980s, his output, if anything, speeded up by the early 1990s. If asked why he carried on writing when he no longer needed the money, he would reply dismissively, "It gives me something to do in the mornings," or words to that effect. This was a deliberately ambiguous answer, both frivolous and serious. He had to fill in time before lunch, and writing was how he had done that for 30 years, so why change? But being a writer was also how he defined himself. A writer was what he was. If he ceased to write, what would he be? It was better to avoid that question by not ceasing to write. The daily tussle with words was both torture and joy, as necessary to him as the presence of Hilly or the consumption of alcohol. What he feared most was not being able to think of anything more to write, and it is not fanciful to see too the figure of his father standing behind him at his desk and urging him on. Looking back over the years, Amos could find many reasons for satisfaction with his working life. No other serious novelist and poet of his generation had produced so much, in so many forms, created so much controversy and approval, earned more money or public honour, and was still so prolifically at work when well past 70. Father Amos would surely have been proud. But of his private life, Amos could be less confident, and his doubts about himself in this department show through his latest novel, You Can't Do Both. It is the most biographical Amos has ever written, in the sense that its story follows more closely than any other the course of his own life. Its hero, Robin Davies, was, like Amos, born in South London, grew up as the only child in a suburban household, went to school in the city, proceeded from there to Oxford, joined the wartime army, returned to Oxford, made his young girlfriend pregnant, married her, and found a lecturer's job at a provincial university. Both Robin and Amos are inextinguishably promiscuous by nature, and remain adamantly determined to be so, whether single or married. There are smaller points of likeness between Robin and Amos, too. Both have mothers called Peggy. In both life and fiction, Peggy had to persuade the parents of her son's pregnant girlfriend to come to their wedding. The mood, the atmosphere of Robin's home life in South London resembles Amos's too in its enforced intimacy between two parents and a single child, and in particular the determination of Robin's father to weed out the undesirables from Robin's circle of friends. Undesirable because threateningly lower class. But there are differences as well. Robin is Welsh, goes as a schoolboy for holidays with relatives in Wales, takes his girlfriend there on a wartime leave. Amos was or did none of those things. No novel of his is ever lifted straight from the life. Apart from any other reason for this, life is too sloppily arranged to give form to the plot which any novel must have. Amis therefore invented the two incidents that frame the plot and give the story its moral structure. At the beginning of the book, the young Robin has 2 dates one Saturday when he is free from school. He believes he can quite easily fit in one after the other, but his father tells him no, he can't do both. At the end of the book, when Robin is married to Nancy and has 2 daughters, Nancy surprises him at a hotel where he is booked in for a bout of adultery. She too tells him he can't do both. He can have her and his girls, or all the other women he wants, but not both. Just before Nancy arrives, Robin speculates about why he behaves the way he does. He argues himself round in a circle, and comes to no more consoling an answer than that he has a grim determination not to let a bagatelle like a hurried marriage interfere with what he had always done, or at least wanted to do. When Nancy confronts him, he mumbles that he's sorry. No excuses, just me being a shit. But she won't accept that. Even now she thinks he doesn't really blame himself. If he does something bad, he puts it down to how he was brought up, what he has read and been taught, or just being one of the products of the age we live in. When he does something good, though, it's full marks to Robin Davies, Esquire, and his marvellous natural sense of right and wrong. The story of the novel may closely reflect the story of Amis's first 4 decades, but they are not a contemporary diary. The novel was written in 1993, 60 to 40 years after the period it describes. The Amis who wrote it was not the Amis who lived it. The writer is an old man reflecting on his youth, and what it seems to be telling him is that his father was not so wrong after all. Arbitrary and absurd though they seemed at the time, there was merit in his codes of behaviour, even if they were less than perfect. Rebelling against such codes by persistent infidelity to his wife was no proper way of readjusting the rules, justified by no fad or fashion of argument, no better, in fact, than selfish self-indulgence. The novel is a novel, taking its place alongside the others in Amis's oeuvre. But it is also an apology, a message of love and regret, and it is addressed to Hilly. Epilogue. I wrote Amis's biography in the sequence in which it appears here, beginning with the introduction, portrait of the artist in age. Having drafted that, I put it aside, and did not read it until I had finished the last chapter and begun making revisions to the whole book. Reading the introduction again 18 months or so after I had written it, the portrait seemed slightly out of focus. Amis was no longer quite the same man I had described. He had aged. He was not so mentally spry. He was deafer, more crotchety. If there was a gap in the conversation, he was no longer certain to fill it. People he did not like or know well were more likely to be made unwelcome in his small circle at the Garrick Club or at the Queen's public house. Amis continued his daily routines, work, Garrick, snooze, and so on, but somehow the scale and scope of his days seemed to have shrunk. He did not want to go anywhere that could not be reached in half an hour by cab. He was physically slower. His back gave him pain. Seated in the chair from which he watched television, he would constantly shift about to make himself more comfortable, sitting back, then leaning forward, propping his feet on a stool, then dropping them to the floor, and he fell over. I saw him trip on a rug and fall, toppling to the floor like some great stricken oak or beast, though a nice Amis touch, without spilling a drop of whiskey in his glass. Change had come by degrees, not through some single setback or series of them, so I did not really notice it was happening until I came to reread my portrait and saw that it had. But I decided to leave the portrait unchanged. It seemed to give a fuller impression of the man Amis had been at his best, a portrait fairer than would have been one redrawn to show how he had declined. Besides, Amis did not change out of recognition. Above all, he still wrote. If anything, his output of words seemed to accelerate. In the 3 years it took me to write and publish his biography, he finished and published a book of short stories, Mr. Barrett's Secrets, started, finished, and published 2 novels, You Can't Do Both and The Biographer's Moustache, and wrote his own answer to Fowler's Modern English Usage, which at his death was still unpublished. As if all this was not enough, in his last months he advanced 100 or so pages into yet another novel. Amis's energies remained strong, though they had become more narrowly concentrated on fewer things. It may be that the experience of having his biography written helped shape those last 2 published novels. Amos always picked up new situations or themes in what was going on around him. You Can't Do Both traces the life of a youth from South London who goes to Oxford, becomes a lecturer in a provincial university, and is unfaithful to his wife. Did my asking him questions about all these things in his own life put the idea of the book into his head? I don't know for sure, because I didn't ask him, but I suspect it must have had at least something to do with it. Certainly the biographer's moustache was prompted by our biographical encounter. It is about an older literary chap having his biography written by a younger journalist, a description that fits Amos and fits me. The literary chap and the journalist in the novel are not at all like him or me, but the basic relationship between them, of subject and inquirer, is the same as it was between us. All Amos ever needed was the right cue, a person, a situation, an idea, and he was off following a new fictional trail, wherever it might take him. All Amos ever needed was the right cue, a person, a situation, an idea, and he was off following a new fictional trail, wherever it might take him. We continued to meet after the biography was finished, at the pub and the club and at his home. He suggested that we write a book together, a sort of postscript to the biography, to be based on tape recordings of conversations across his dining table. I don't quite know what he expected of this project, except that it gave us an excuse to renew the Thursday night sessions we had regularly had while I was writing his biography. If nothing else came out of them, they would at least be an agreeable way to fill in time talking and drinking before the bill on television. In August 1995, Amos went to Swansea for his usual stay over the 3 weeks of the Garrick Club's annual summer holiday. As I had done in previous years, I went there to join him for a few days towards the end of his excursion. He had told me over the phone that he felt as bad as he ever had in his life, but said it insouciantly enough for me not to worry much. But when I saw him, it was clear that his banter had covered a very great deal of pain. 8 days earlier he had fallen over after lunch with a friend. The effect was to raise the pain in his back to a far higher intensity than ever in the past. The day before I arrived, his speech had started to slur. 2 days later I drove him back to the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital in London. His Swansea hostess, Virginia Rush, came too. He was able to come home from there to Primrose Hill, but he soon needed intensive care, and went back into hospital, this time to University College. On Sunday, October the 22nd, he died. There was no struggle at the end. He simply stopped breathing. Throughout those last 2 months, I always thought that Amos would pull through. He had come to seem somehow indestructible and permanent, still strong in spite of his decline. He told me once that he fully intended to see in the millennium, and I believed him. There were moments in those last weeks when he was his old self, as when he said he was busily collecting material from his life in hospital for another novel, to be called The Last Old Devil, or The Oldest Devil. The comings and goings of the medical staff were giving him plenty to think about. But anything less than full recovery would have been most miserable for him. Suppose he had been unable to go to the Garrick or to write. He would have hated his life to become more circumscribed than it already had. As full recovery became less likely, so death came to seem the more merciful alternative. 30th of October, 1995. The day after he died, the obituary of Amos I had written several months before appeared in The Guardian. I also wrote a tribute to him in that week's Spectator. It is with these that I close this most unexpected and unwelcome epilogue to the paperback edition of Kingsley Amos, a biography. From The Guardian. Kingsley Amos has died at the age of 73, certain of his place up alongside Woodhouse, Waugh, and Powell among the English comic masters of the 20th century. His achievement as a novelist tended to obscure his very considerable accomplishments as a poet. Amos was, in fact, a fully subscribed member of that increasingly rare species, the all-round man of letters. He wrote everything from advertising copy to restaurant reviews, radio plays to television scripts, political polemic, on behalf of both left and right, to literary criticism, science fiction, to a James Bond sequel. His style was rich, acute, and fastidious, and unmistakably his own. Amos's output was prodigiously large as well as various. 24 novels, more than a dozen collections of poetry, short stories, and criticism, and a large miscellany of other work, including volumes on drink, politics, and himself, his memoirs. It was a perverse indication of his standing that, while he was knighted by the Thatcher government, Amos received no doctorate from a university, unlike his friend, the poet Philip Larkin, who notched up half a dozen. Amos was not much admired in academic circles, where he was seen as having committed several vulgar errors. He was popular, he was politically incorrect, he wrote too much. Furthermore, no donnish or critical exegesis was required to explain the meanings of his fiction. It spoke for itself. Worse still, he came to think not much of the English lit trade he had once practiced himself, and didn't mind saying so. Time will judge, but it will surely judge that the knighthood was the juster verdict. Amos's wit, shrewdness, and verbal dexterity, his ability to turn quite unexceptional characters and everyday situations into something very much larger and more memorable, the sheer pleasure of reading him, with regular breaks in which to bawl with laughter, will ensure that he is read when more fashionable writers are forgotten. Or he will be read so long as ordinary, intelligent people still care about fiction of quality. In art, as in life, Amos was unable to conceal his feelings. If he was bored, he showed it in a frown, and if he was amused, he laughed hugely. His books, too, reflected his current preoccupations, personal or social, whatever they might be. As a result, his fiction tracks closely changes in the morals and manners of his times, from Lucky Jim Dixon's hapless fumblings in the mid-1950s to the permissiveness of the 1960s and the uncertainties beyond. As a moving picture of middle-class relations between the sexes in the second half of the 20th century, his novels are unmatched. But they also track change that was going on inside Amos himself. Early Amos heroes may not have thought much of their jobs or their bosses, but they certainly had an appetite for pleasure, especially in women. The later novels are full of a sense of disintegration and disillusion, with women especially. Taken as a whole, the sequence of his novels reflects with remarkable clarity the movement in Amos's own feelings as he moved from youth to age. In later years, the real sensitivity of his work seemed sometimes to get lost sight of beneath his image, that of an arch-reactionary, misogynist boozer, and scourge of modernities in all things from poetry to restaurant food. It was easy to depict him in blimpish red face, staring apoplectically and uncomprehendingly out of the Garrick club bar at the fools in the street below. Amos was by then a fully committed conservative, who, for example, admired almost everything about Lady Thatcher except her treatment of the universities, for which he thought Oxford was quite right to withhold the honorary degree it customarily offers any of its graduates who become Prime Minister. But Amos also liked to be seen in a strong light. If he was to be conservative, let him be thoroughgoing about it. Should a journalist call to ask his views on some matter of the day, he would get a robust answer or a flea in his ear. Besides, strong opinions were likely to annoy people, and were therefore much more fun to hold than half-baked ones. He believed that when at the typewriter absolute integrity should prevail. But when a writer came to sell himself and his wares in the marketplace, more or less anything went. He made mischief on his own behalf, and in doing so did mischief to his own reputation. Amos's prime motive in moving to the right from the communism of his youth was his detestation of communist tyranny, something he thought post-war intellectuals far too easily ignored. But there remained a strong thread of continuity in his beliefs and attitudes, deriving from his lower-class origins in Norbury, southwest London. As seen from here, much of the world appeared to be dominated by snobberies and exclusivities, which Amos came to detest, in literary no less than social or political affairs. Culture, as the possession of a class, was just as repellent to him as such a class's hold on other kinds of power. Why should literature be fenced off like a private estate? It should be accessible to all. Amos was, at the same time, powerfully attracted by popular culture, the films, jazz, detective stories, and science fiction that competed for his attention during his childhood in the 1930s. If highbrow art was to keep its primacy over the lowbrow variety, then it too must entertain. It was not much fun, he would say, to read a book you had to read another book to understand. Literature, at first, seemed to be the possession of the traditional upper class. Later, it appeared to have fallen into the hands of another class of professional pseuds and trend hounds and posers of all kinds, who fenced themselves off behind obscurities, and so kept ordinary people at a respectfully admiring distance. These new masters of the literary circus may have been as humble in their origins as Amos, but the exclusiveness they created in their field was not so very different from that contrived by the old upper class in its. Latterly, Amos rarely read anything new that could be described as literary fiction. Even the much-acclaimed novels of his son Martin were more glanced at than read. Thrillers were more acceptable because they had old-fashioned strengths, like plots and characters. They might not promise a great deal, but they delivered what they promised. And they were not boring. In Amos's eyes, almost the worst thing in literature or in people. Amos was in favour of élites, because he was in favour of excellence. But élites should earn their status by their achievement, not by inheritance, or by becoming one of the self-appointed experts who laid down the law for everybody else. The increasing dominance of such experts in literature as in politics does much to explain Amos's steady drift towards conservatism. As someone who owed his own education to scholarships, and had then gone on to become a university teacher, he particularly detested what he saw as the vandalism of the Labour Education Secretary Anthony Crossland in destroying the grammar schools. In Amos's view, a typical piece of both intellectual and social class arrogance. Amos was born on the 16th of April 1922 at Clapham, South London, to Peggy and William Amos, a mustard manufacturer's clerk employed at Coleman's office in the city. As an only child, Amos was both cosseted and ordered about. The domestic atmosphere was warm but smothering. Perhaps as a result, Amos in his early teens began to suffer from the anxieties and panic attacks that were to dog him intermittently all his life. He suffered bouts of depersonalization, a feeling that he was no longer there, and came to fear travelling in lifts or underground trains, or being left at night in an empty house. After being treated to a flip around Croydon Aerodrome in 1932, Amos vowed never to fly again, and never did. Partial escape from the restrictions of home came when he went to the City of London School on the Thames at Blackfriars. Here he found the education both rigorous and liberal. Rigorous in its concentration on a traditional curriculum, but liberal in finding time for art and music, as well as being entirely hospitable to minorities, like Catholics and Jews. Among Amos's right-wing attitudes there was never a hint of racism. Amos won an English scholarship to St. John's College, Oxford. Soon after he went up in 1941, he met Philip Larkin, with whom he formed the most important friendship of his life. At Oxford they mostly fooled about with other undergraduates, drinking, listening to jazz, behaving badly, like hearties, except that they never went near a sports field. Their personal friendship ripened later. Larkin gave Amos detailed advice on his first novel, Lucky Jim, but Amos did not ask for his help with the novel again. Nor did they much discuss literary matters. Amos had little taste for this, except when teaching students. He believed the business of a novelist was to write novels, not talk about them. Their influence on each other was mostly indirect. When writing, they would have the other as invisible audience, whose approval each most wanted. After 4 Oxford terms, Amos was summoned to the army, commissioned and assigned as a signal master to 2nd Army Headquarters, landing in Normandy at the end of June 1944, his first visit abroad. Being abroad with the army was all right because there were colleagues and a purpose, but Amos never did much warm to being abroad as a civilian on holiday, though he liked America, where he taught at Princeton and Nashville, very much indeed. Amos's army job was to organize signals traffic, and he saw no action at first hand, but the army enlarged his understanding of people and the world. Idealism in politics was no longer enough, since all around him he saw men restlessly pursuing their own interests. Besides, the world was too complicated to be organized according to the easy formulas of left-wing politics. Imagine the Fabian Society, say, or the General Post Office mounting the invasion of Europe. When Amos returned to Oxford on early release in 1945, he was no longer the communist he had been when he left, though he did not vote for a Tory government until 1970. In 1946, Amos met the 17-year-old Hilary, always Hilly, Bardwell, a model at the Ruskin School of Art, in an Oxford coffee shop. She became pregnant, they married, and Philip was born in 1948. In 1949, with a first to his credit, Amos became a lecturer at the University College in Swansea. His first serious attempt at a novel, The Legacy, was turned down by several publishers, but his second, Lucky Jim, was welcomed by Gollancz. Its publication in 1954 was a great success, winning a Somerset Maugham Award, and thereafter Amos's literary reputation was rarely in doubt. He became identified with literary movements, The Movement and The Angry Young Men, but he never saw these as much more than labels pinned on him by journalists in search of trends. In 1961, Amos left Swansea for a fellowship at Peterhouse. He came to think of his years in Wales as the happiest of his life, and in the 1980s and 1990s always went back to Swansea in the summer. But Amos stayed in Cambridge only 2 years, finding university social life unbearably formal, and his teaching load enjoyable, but if properly done, too engrossing to leave enough energy over for writing. He resigned and rented a house in Majorca, being abroad an unlikely place, but Robert Graves would be a near neighbour, planning to try writing there full-time for a year. But his plans were aborted. Amos had started an affair with the novelist Elizabeth Jane Howard, whom he had met while taking part in a seminar on sex in literature at the Cheltenham Literary Festival, of which he was director. This was far from the first affair he had got involved in since marrying Hilly, but it was the first in which he openly took the other woman away with him on holiday. When he returned, he found that Hilly had taken the children, there were now 3, Philip, Martin and Sally, off to the house in Majorca. Amos rejoined Howard in London and stayed with her, and when he and Hilly were divorced, they married. They were at first romantically happy, but after a few years the marriage began to disintegrate. In 1980, Howard bolted, her own word. She offered to come back if Amos would give up drinking completely, but he refused. It wasn't that he couldn't. Soon afterwards he stopped for 6 months following an accident and a spell in hospital, but he had always drunk a lot and thought total abstinence an intolerable demand which he would resent forever if he agreed to it. Amos very much did not like being left alone in his large house in Hampstead, but his sons soon came up with an alternative. Why did he not establish a new home with Hilly and her third husband, Lord Kilmarnock? They were short of money, he of company. It made sense. Philip and Martin did not believe it could last long, but it did. The household, like something out of an Iris Murdoch novel, as Amos would say, was not without its tensions, but in divided quarters it survived intact until Amos's death. The 1980s and 1990s were scarcely happy. Age and Amos's anxious spirit did not allow for contentment, but they were far from miserable. Amos developed a routine: work, lunch at the Garrick, asleep, more work, television, supper, books, bed. His divorce from Hilly was always his deepest regret, but she was around, and the 3 children not far away, and he continued to write almost to the end. What more could he hope for? From The Spectator. You would not expect, say, P.D. James or Ruth Rendell to stick a knife in you just because they write about murderers. But ever since Lucky Jim, Kingsley Amis has been seen not only to resemble his characters, but to actually be them. Over the years he has been variously depicted in the style of his heroes as drunk, Philistine, lefty, righty, sex-mad, misogynist, curmudgeon, blimp, and scourge of modernist error in everything from cooking to poetry. There was at least some truth in all these images, because Kingsley's heroes always started out from himself, even if they finished up very different. And Kingsley, it has to be said, hugely enjoyed hamming it up in the roles he had been assigned to. But it is not in any of those stereotypical guises that I shall remember him. He was, above all, quick-minded, verbally agile, terribly funny, a vigorous persecutor of bores, pseuds and wankers, and a most tremendous mimic. Whenever I think of The Spectator's late editor, George Gale, I can't help seeing Kingsley's growling, shrugging imitation of him, which seemed more like George than George. Only a few weeks ago I happened to rouse him, Kingsley, I mean, from a post-lunch snooze, and he turned his waking up into a wonderful imitation of his father being woken in similar circumstances, and pretending that he had only been pretending to sleep. Kingsley could be kind, generous, affectionate, and charming, though he chose not to advertise those sides of himself, probably because they were worthy, and therefore dull. The Garrick Club bar already seems a drabber place. I shall miss Kingsley most horribly. This concludes the reading of Kingsley Amis, a biography by Eric Jacobs. This book was read by Stuart Langton.